Hallchos Mlova Veleva, Chapter 19. 1. When the court attaches the property of a borrower to expropriate it, they should expropriate only land of intermediate quality for a lender. According to scriptural law, a creditor should receive only the property of inferior quality, as implied. Deuteronomy, you shall stand outside, and the person who owes you money shall bring the security out to you. What is the tendency of a person to bring out? The least valuable of his utensils. Our sages, however, ordained that a creditor should expropriate property of intermediate quality so that people would not refuse to give loans. When does the above apply? When the lender comes to collect from the borrower himself. If, however, the borrower dies and the lender comes to collect from his heirs, whether they are below or above the age of majority, he may collect only property of inferior value too. We do not collect payments from property that has been sold when the debtor owns property that is still in his possession. This applies even if the property in his possession is of inferior quality and the property that has been sold is of intermediate or superior quality, and whether the property was sold or given away as presents. If the property that has not been sold is flooded, the creditor may collect the property that has been sold. The rationale is that since it has been devastated, it is as if it no longer exists. 3. The creditor is given the upper hand in the following situation. Reuven sold all his fields to Shimon, and Shimon sold one of his fields to Levi. If one of Reuven's creditors comes to expropriate property in payments for his debt, he may expropriate property from either Shimon or Levi. When does the above apply? When Levi purchased property of intermediate value. If, however, he purchased property that was of superior or inferior value, the creditor cannot expropriate money from Levi, for Levi will tell him, I purposely took the trouble of purchasing a field that you have no right to expropriate so that you will not have a claim against me. Similarly, if Levi purchased a field of intermediate worth and left Shimon a field of intermediate worth, similar to the one of intermediate worth that he expropriated, the creditor cannot expropriate the field from Levi, for he will tell the creditor, I left your property to expropriate as payments for your debt. 4. We have already explained that payments for damages should be expropriated from property of superior value. A lender should expropriate property of intermediate value, and the money due alone by virtue of ksuba should be expropriated from property of inferior value. When a person owns only property of superior value and property of inferior value, damages should be expropriated from the property of superior value. The lender and a woman collecting ksuba, money due to her by virtue of ksuba, should expropriate the property of inferior value. If he owns only property of superior value and property of intermediate value, damages should be expropriated from the property of superior value, and a lender and a woman collecting the money due her by virtue of her ksuba should expropriate the property of intermediate value. If he owns only property of inferior value and property of intermediate value, damages and payments for a loan should be expropriated from the property of intermediate value, and a woman collecting the money due her by virtue of her ksuba should expropriate the property of inferior value. 5. When a person owns 3 fields and he sells them to 3 people at the same time, they all take the place of the previous owner. Thus, payments for damages should be expropriated from property of superior value. A lender should expropriate property of intermediate value, and the money due by a woman by virtue of her ksuba should be expropriated from property of inferior value. If he sold them one after another, they should all expropriate their due from the last purchaser. If the worth of that property was not sufficient, they should expropriate from the property purchased before it. If the worth of that property is also not sufficient, they should expropriate the property purchased first. This applies even if the last purchaser acquired a property of inferior value, for the purchaser who preceded him can tell the person who seeks to expropriate property, I left you property from which you could collect your debt. 6. When a debtor sells all his properties to one person, one after the other, that person takes the place of the original owner. When does the above apply? When he purchased a property of superior quality last. When, however, he purchased a property of inferior quality last, all their creditors may collect their due from that property. 4. When a person comes to expropriate property, the purchaser will tell him, I left you property from which you can collect your debt. Why does the creditor not tell this person who seeks to expropriate a property when to purchase a property of superior value first, and thus a woman collecting the money due by virtue of her ksuba and a lender would also expropriate their due from the property of superior value? Because this possibility is an ordinance instituted for the sake of the purchaser, and he will tell them, I cannot accept this ordinance. Instead, each type of creditor will collect from the property fit for him. 7. Similarly, the following laws apply when the debtor sold all his properties to one person, one after the other, selling him the property of superior value last, and that purchaser sold the property of inferior and intermediate value to a third party, and retained the property of superior value for himself. All the debtors collect their due from the property of superior value, for the purchaser does not have any property from the original debtor to divert them to. When the purchaser sold the property of a superior value and retained the properties of inferior and intermediate value, payment for damages should be expropriated from property of superior value in the possession of the second purchaser. The debt owed a lender and money due a woman by virtue of her ksuba should be expropriated from the property of intermediate and inferior value that the first purchaser retained. 8. As reflected in the following situation, when a person limits his power to expropriate property, his waiver may extend beyond his original intent. One person borrowed money from a colleague. Afterwards, the borrower sold his property to 2 people, each person purchasing a portion for himself, one after the other. The creditor wrote to the second purchaser pledging that he would not expropriate the property as payment for the debt, and affirmed his commitment with a kinyan. Our sages ruled that he is also not able to expropriate the property sold to the first purchaser. For that purchaser will say to the creditor, I left you the opportunity of collecting the money owed you from the debtor by expropriating the property that the second purchaser bought after I did. You caused yourself a loss by removing your lien on it. Similar laws apply with regard to a woman who seeks to collect the money due her by virtue of her ksuba. If she writes such a waiver to the second purchaser, she loses the right to the money due her by virtue of her ksuba and cannot expropriate property. If whoever such persons write such a waiver to the first purchaser, they may expropriate the property from the second purchaser. The following situation can occur when a borrower sells a field to a purchaser and then the purchaser sells it to a second purchaser. The lender writes to the first purchaser, pledging that he would not expropriate the property as payment for the debt, and affirms his commitment with a kinyan. The creditor may expropriate the property from the second purchaser. The first purchaser may expropriate the property from the creditor because he pledged that he would not expropriate the property, and he did. The second purchaser can then expropriate the property from the first purchaser because he sold it to him. The creditor may then expropriate the property again from the second purchaser, and the cycle continues until they arrange a compromise. Similar laws apply with regard to a woman who seeks to collect the money due her by virtue of her ksuba and makes a pledge to the person who purchased her husband's property. Chapter 20. 1. When a person owes many debts, the person whose debt was made first has the right to expropriate property first from the borrower himself and from his creditors. If a later creditor expropriated property before the last creditor, the first creditor may expropriate it from him. For the person whose debt was established first acquires the property. To what does the above apply? To landed property that the borrower possessed at the time he took the loan. When, however, he purchased landed property after borrowing from many creditors, no one is granted precedence over the others, even if the borrower wrote to each one in the promissory note. So, correction, I've been saying promissory, it's promissory, I think. The property that I will purchase in the future is on lien to you. Instead, all are equal, and whoever comes first and expropriates the property acquires it, even if he was the last to make the loan. 2. When a borrower writes in the promissory note, what I will acquire in the future is on lien to you. Afterwards, purchases a field and then borrows from another person. The field is on lien to the first lender. He has the right to expropriate it first. Similar principles apply even if there are 100 creditors. There is no concept of precedence with regard to the expropriation of movable property. Instead, whoever comes first and expropriates it acquires it, even if he was the last to make the loan. If another person comes and seized possession of movable property belonging to this debtor in order to acquire the property on behalf of one of the creditors, that person does not acquire the property. The rationale is that a person who seizes property on behalf of a creditor is in a situation where a loss is caused to another person does not acquire it. If whoever seizing it would not cause a loss to other people, he does acquire it for him. Similarly, if the borrower tells him, acquire this article on behalf of so-and-so, he acquires it for him. None of the other creditors can expropriate this movable property because another person has already acquired it. 3. When promissory notes are all dated on the same date or at the same hour in a place where the hours are mentioned, whichever creditor comes first and expropriates property, whether landed property or movable property, acquires it. The following laws apply when creditors whose promissory notes are dated on the same date all come to expropriate property together, or when creditors whose promissory notes were dated before one another come to expropriate movable property, for there was no concept of precedence with regard to movable property, or creditors come to expropriate property that the borrower purchased after taking the loan dated last, and the property the borrower possesses is not sufficient to enable each one to collect the debt that is owed to them. How is the property divided? If, when the property is divided in equal portions according to the number of creditors, the person owed the least will receive the amount owed him or less, the property is divided into that number of equal portions. If dividing the property into equal portions would give the person owed the least more than he is owed, this is what should be done. We divide the sum equally among the creditors so that the person owed the least will receive the money that he is owed. He then withdraws. The remaining creditors then divide the balance of the debtor's resources in the following manner. What is implied? A person owed 3 debts, one for a mana, one for 200, and one for 300. If the resources of the debtor total 300 zuz, they're divided 100 each. Similarly, if his resources are less than 300, they should be divided equally among the 3. If his resources total more than 300, the 300 should be divided equally, and then the person owed 100 should withdraw. The remaining money should be divided equally in this same manner. What is implied? If the debtor's resources total 500 or less, the 300 should be divided equally, and then the person owed 100 should withdraw. The balance of 200 or less should then be divided equally among the remaining creditors, and then the second one withdraws. If the debtor's resources total 600, the 300 should be divided equally. Then the person owed 100 should withdraw. Then they divide 200 between the two equally. Then the second one withdraws. The 100 that remains should be given to the person owed 300. Thus, he receives only 300. He thus receives only 300. The debtor's resources should be divided according to this pattern, even if there are 100 creditors, if they come to divide the resources at the same time. There are, however, going to rule that the resources should be divided in proportion to the amount owed each creditor. I don't get the problem here. If one was for a mana, one was for 200, one was 300, then everyone's paid up if he has 600. What would be as far as do it differently? I don't get that Rambam's example. Okay, whatever. 5. The fact that a promissory note is not dated correctly creates difficulties for its bearer. For example, Reuven and Shimon each possess a promissory note stating that Levi owes them money. The promissory note possessed by Reuven is dated 5 Nisan, and that possessed by Shimon is dated Nisan, without specifying a day. Levi possesses only one field that is not equal in value to the debts owed them both. Reuven is allowed to take possession of the field, for perhaps the promissory note owed Shimon was signed at the end of Nisan. Similarly, Shimon cannot expropriate a field that was sold by Levi from Iyar or afterwards, for the purchaser will tell him perhaps the date of your promissory note is the 1st of Nisan. There is a field that was not sold at that time in the possession of Reuven. Expropriate it, and then let Reuven, whose promissory note is dated afterwards, come and expropriate the field from me. Therefore, if Reuven and Shimon write each other a document granting power of attorney, they may expropriate a field that was sold after Iyar using both vantage points. Similar laws apply if Levi sold one field twice, composing separate deeds of sale for Reuven and for Shimon, with one dated on the 1st of Nisan and one Nisan without specifying a date. Chapter 21. 1. When a creditor expropriates a field, he may also expropriate the increase in value that the purchaser brings about within the field. This applies whether the field increases in value because of an investment or it increases in value as a matter of course. There is, however, a difference between the two instances. If it increases in value as a matter of course, the creditor may expropriate the entire increase in value. If it increases in value because of an investment, the creditor may expropriate only half of the increase. What is implied? Reuven was owed a debt of 200 zuz by Shimon. Shimon sold a field to Levi for a mana. Levi made an investment in the field and caused its value to increase and is now worth 200. When Reuven expropriates it from Levi, he expropriates it from him for 100, and also the 50 that constitutes half the increase of value. If it increased in value on its own accord, for instance, the price rose or trees grew, he can expropriate the entire amount. Great sages issued a ruling stating that a purchaser should not have lesser legal power than a person who occupies the field belonging to a colleague without permission, in which instance the increase of the field's value is appraised and the squatter is given the weaker position. Therefore, if the field increased 100 zuz in value and Levi spent 50, Levi should receive all of his expenses and half of the increase in value beyond the expenses. The other half of the increase in value and the principal should be expropriated by the creditor. These are the words of logic, and it is appropriate to rule accordingly. The purchaser then returns and expropriates the principal from Shimon's property, including even property that he sold or gave away after the time he sold his field to Levi. The increase in value that the creditor expropriated from Levi, the purchaser, whether the increase in value or the entire increase, Levi may then expropriate only from property in the possession of Shimon, for it is an enactment instituted for the sake of society not to expropriate a property increase in value, nor produce eaten by a thief, nor the sustenance given to widow and the deceased daughters from property that has been sold. The rationale is that these are matters that have no limit, and it is one of the leniencies associated with Iksuba that a woman is not granted the opportunity of expropriating the money due her by virtue of Iksuba from a property's increase in value. Why is a creditor able to expropriate only half the increase of value that comes after the investment was made? Because the increase in value comes after Shimon. The original owner borrowed money from Reuven and sold the property to Levi. Thus, Reuven and Levi can be considered to be two creditors of Shimon's, and the increase in the value of the field is an increase in value of his property that came after he borrowed from both of them. In such an instance, they divide the increase equally, as we have explained. Accordingly, the following rules apply in the ensuing circumstances. Reuven borrowed money from Shimon, and in the promissory note wrote that he's extending the lien to the property that I will acquire in the future. He then borrowed 200 zuz from Levi, and in the promissory note wrote that he's extending the lien to the property that I will acquire in the future. He then purchased the field and sold it to Yehuda for 150 zuz. Yehuda made an investment and caused its value to increase, and ultimately it was worth 300 zuz. Shimon and Levi expropriate the principal and divide it equally, thus each receives 75 zuz. The three, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda, then divide the 150 zuz of the field's increase in value according to the principles that we explained. Thus, Shimon expropriates the complete payment of the money owed him from this field. Levi expropriates 137.5, and Yehuda receives 62.5 from the field's increase in value. They should divide the increase in value in this manner. Those principles apply even if there are 100 creditors. 2. All of the produce that the purchaser consumed, however, is not expropriated from him. The produce that is attached to the land, by contrast, including even the produce that no longer needs the nurture of the land, for instance, grapes that are ready to be harvested, may be expropriated by a creditor in the same way as he expropriates the property's increase in value. 3. When the recipient of a present invests in it and causes its value to increase, the creditor may not expropriate any of its increase in value. Instead, be evaluated its worth at the time the present was given and allow him to expropriate that amount. If, however, it increases in value as a matter of course, the creditor may expropriate the entire field. If the person giving the present accept responsibility for it, the creditor may expropriate the increase in value from this field just as he would if it were in the possession of a purchaser. Why is a creditor given the right to expropriate half of a property's increase in value from a purchaser but not from a person who receives a present? Because the seller of the property wrote to the purchaser in the deed of sale, I am obligated to you for the principal, the labor you invest in it, and the increase in value that you will bring to it. I take responsibility for everything. The purchaser accepted this stipulation, for the purchaser took possession of the field on the condition that if the increase in the value of the field was expropriated from him, he would seek recompense from the seller. Even if the stipulation was not written in the deed of sale, it is a matter of public knowledge that this is law governing the seller's responsibility to the purchaser. With regard to a present, by contrast, this stipulation does not apply. Hence, a creditor may not expropriate any increase in value that the recipient of a present brought about through investment. 4. Similarly, if orphans who inherit an estate increase its value, a creditor of their father may not expropriate any of its increase in value. If, however, the property increases in value as a matter of course, he may expropriate the entire increase. 5. The following laws apply when a creditor expropriates property from a debt owed him from a purchaser from the principal and half of the increase in the property's value. We then consider what remains of the landed property. If the land that remains would be of value to the purchaser, for instance, in a field, an area where 9 kabma grain could be sown, in a garden, an area where half a kabba vegetables could be sown, the creditor and the purchaser should become partners with regard to the land. If the property is not large enough to be divided in a manner that a smaller portion of sufficient size would be referred to as a field or a garden, the creditor should reimburse the purchaser financially for the increase in value of the field, as is due him. 6. The following rules apply when a field was designated as an apaitiki. The creditor may expropriate the entire field. We consider the half of the field's increase in value, which must be repaid to the purchaser. If half of the increase in value exceeds the purchaser's investment, he should collect the amount he invested from the creditor. He is given only this amount because the creditor can tell him it is my field that increased in value. He should collect the remainder of the money due him from the field's increase in value from the seller. If half of the field's increase in value is less than the purchaser's investment, the purchaser should be reimbursed by the person who expropriated the field for only half of the field's increase in value. He then collects from the seller the other half of the field's increase in value. 7. When a creditor comes to expropriate property from heirs, and the heirs claim we caused the value of the property to increase, but the creditor claims perhaps it was your father who caused the property to increase in value, the burden of proof is on the heirs. If the heirs bring proof that they increased the value of the property, we evaluate the increase and their expenses. They receive the lesser of the two, and they are given this amount in money. When does the above apply? When the field was designated in apaitiki. If, however, it was not designated in apaitiki, if the heirs desire, they have the right to pay the creditor the debt he is owed and absolve his claim. Or if they desire, they may take a share of the land that is equivalent to the value of the increase they brought to the value of the property.